After the Storm, hosted by the Post-Crash Economic Society, featuring Sir Vince Cable. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about who we are. I'm Alex, I'm part of the Post-Crash Economic Society, and we're a group of students who are campaigning for changes in the way economics is taught. We work alongside a national campaign called CIPE, and today is their Global Action Day. Both groups think that after 2008, the global economic landscape changed, and people's understanding of how the economy functions changed, but the university syllabus didn't. We think the theory that's taught in class is important, but there's room for so much more, such as alternative schools of thought, and a focus on real-life events like the financial crisis in 2008. So we learn from our mistakes, and there doesn't have to be another sequel to After the Storm. Which is why we're having to put on events like this to analyse real-world events. This is how the event's going to proceed. Our speaker's going to give a presentation, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. After that, there's going to be a book sale just in the next room over, where you'll get the opportunity to have your book signed by the speaker. And then after that, we're going to head over to the SU for a drink, and we'd love it if you come join us. So, without further ado, tonight's speaker is best known as a British politician who served as Secretary of State between 2010 and 2015. He was a Member of Parliament for Twickenham between 1997 and 2015, and later on in that year was knighted for his services to the country. In 2009, he released a widely praised account of the 2008 financial crisis called The Storm, and has just recently released his long-anticipated sequel, After the Storm. It's been described by The Guardian as a lucid, erudite analysis of the global economy and Britain's place in it in the 5 years between 2010 and 2015. Viewed from the vantage point of someone who was a former member of the coalition. And now here to share that economic insight with us, please could I have a massive round of applause for Sir Vince Cable.
Well, can I thank you for the invite and congratulate the people who got this society going and sustained it. I mean, I studied economics an awful long time ago, about 50 years ago, and I had the benefit of a very eclectic kind of economics education. We had kind of standard neoclassical, micro, we had some disciples of Keynes, like Kahn and Joan Robinson, and we had some, Marxist economics, Maurice Dobb, with economic history and others, and I benefited from having that range of contrasting views about economics. And I do sense that in recent years, we've narrowed down to a kind of orthodoxy, which is probably wrong, actually, in some key areas, but is by definition narrow. And I think anything like your society, which tries to challenge the practitioners and teachers of economics to think in a different way, is very much to be welcome. Let me just give a few kind of introductory remarks explaining why I'm here and what all this is about, and then I'll take you through, hopefully, a reasonably coherent account of the thread of argument in the book. First of all, as Alexander's just said, this is a sequel to a book I wrote at the beginning of the financial crisis. There have been hundreds of books written about it, and many of them a lot better than mine, but I think mine had the merit of being the first, and as a result I got quite a lot of attention. And the reason I wrote it was this. I was an opposition politician at the time. I spoke for my party on economic matters, and it was clear running up to 2008 that there was something seriously wrong. The banks were lending in a wildly irresponsible way. The housing market was out of control. And yet nobody wanted to know. It was quite extraordinary. I mean, I did the rounds of the Governor of the Bank of England, the Treasury, all these people. No, everything's fine. You know, the economy's booming. You know, you're imagining things. And then, of course, we had the crisis itself. And what was very, very clear was that very few people, if any, understood what the hell was going on. And part of the reason for the confusion was that lying at the back of everybody's analysis was a kind of model of the world based around the concept of efficient financial markets, in which financial markets are by definition always right because they factor in information. And markets had just collapsed. There'd been a systemic failure. And there was very, very little understanding of what was going on. And when I started to write, it was very clear that conventional economics simply didn't deal with the kind of problem we had in front of us. There were some very fine writers like Hyman Minsky in the 60s, 70s, who wrote about boom-bust cycles, Kindleberger, a very good economic historian. But in order to get a proper account of what was happening in 2008, I had to go back to John Stuart Mill, who wrote a brilliant account, I think back in 1825, about what happens when you get a collapse in the banking system and the impact of that on credit and real economic activity. There was very little, basic economics dealing with the kind of systemic failure that we had at that time. And we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. I mean, I did use a model or metaphor which is about a storm, but actually I think if I reflected a little bit more on it, I would have chosen a medical metaphor, that actually what happened was the economic equivalent of a heart attack. And although, in many ways, the patient is recovered and, the economy is in reasonable shape, large-scale unemployment has disappeared, you could talk about recovery, all these things have happened. What people are very often missing is that we're still connected to the life support system. And I'll come on to this in more detail later. But if you have the mental image of a heart attack victim, the victim's now running around, happy, healthy, seemingly recovered, but there's a little wire in the back connecting up to the adrenaline pump. And that, of course, as you know, is cheap money, ultra-cheap money, QE, other unorthodox monetary policy that is still very prevalent. And I'll come back onto the implications of that. So that's the first general point I want to make, which was that what I'm doing here is going back after 7 years, 5 years of which I spent as one of the, I suppose, key economic ministers in the government, trying to sort out the consequences of the crisis and reflecting on where we now are. I think the second general point is I want to talk predominantly about economics and economic policy, but it's very difficult to separate that out from politics. The two things are interwoven. I don't know, I presume most of you here are economics students. Is that broadly the case? Or are there a few who aren't? Okay, no hands go up, a few. But the point I would make is that what we have to look at is political economy. I mean, just to take an obvious point, the reason we had the coalition government, which I was a part, was almost entirely because of the financial crisis. It's very, very unlikely that my party would have agreed to work with the Conservatives, who've been our enemies for decades, had it not been for the fact that in May 2010 we believed and were told, and I think plausibly believed, that we were in the middle of a very, very profound crisis that we couldn't just walk away from. And it was the politics of the coalition were driven by the economics of the crisis. I mean, not just that, but if you look at politics today, it's very kind of strange. I mean, throughout my lifetime, you've had a kind of predictable political alignment from right to left, and that's essentially what politics has been about. But within the last few years, you've had this upsurge of kind of populist movements, and Trump in the US is an obvious example of that. But we've got France, Marine Le Pen, the National Front, even very gentle, kind of orderly places like Holland, which the leading party is now an extreme kind of xenophobic anti-Muslim party. Sweden, I was a couple of weeks ago, probably the most settled social democracy in Western Europe, now being rapidly overtaken by kind of extreme populist xenophobic parties. It's what I wrote about 20 years ago, a book called The Politics of Identity, which rather anticipated this. And if you look at the UK at the moment and you ask, what are the issues that are getting people going, it is Scotland, Europe, and immigration. They're not things that fit within the traditional left-right paradigm. There are issues around identity. And I think one can only explain this in terms of the anger, the alienation, the confusion, which is being created by the financial crisis and its aftermath, which have left millions of people significantly worse off, looking for scapegoats, and this has fed into the political system. So although I'm talking predominantly about economics, I think one has to look at it in a political context. I think my third general introductory point is I'm going to be talking predominantly about the UK, because that's where we are. I was a British minister, that's the perspective I have. But, throughout, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're dealing with a global economy, highly integrated. Globalization is a cliche, but it's a reality. The share of economies in trade, in direct investment, migration flows are larger than at any time historically, except for 1913, and that's worth reflecting as to why there was a sudden drop after 1913. But a massive degree of integration and a big change in the centre of gravity of the world economy. I'll come to this at the end, but what is often overlooked is that the world economy within the last decade, probably 15 years, certainly the last decade, has been driven by emerging markets, particularly China, increasingly India. Most of you will be aware that on the way we now look at GDP, based on a purchasing power parity basis, China probably now has the biggest economy in the world, having overtaken the US. One can quibble about measurement, but we're talking about economic power and purchasing power being in a different place, with implications for capital flows, commodity prices, and much else. So that's the context. Look, let me start with the aftermath of the crisis. The most striking thing about it is that for the first time since the Second World War, we've had cycles, obviously, ups and downs, but for the first time since the war, we've had a crisis that has created permanent losses on a significant scale. This needs a bit of updating to last year, but certainly some countries, which include the UK, lost permanently about 10% of their economy. In other words, below the trend being sustained at pre-crisis levels. Interestingly enough, the four countries that are at the top, Greece obviously is a particular case that you're well aware of, but Ireland, Spain and the UK all had mega housing bubbles. And of course the UK has returned to that at the present time. And although the UK in many ways is now being hailed as a great success story, and to some extent it is, if we look at the damage that was done by the crisis, it's up there near the top. We were far more damaged than the United States or Germany. And almost certainly that's attributable to the very large share of the major banks in the UK economy. I'll come back to that in a moment. So we're operating in a context where the crisis didn't just cause pain at the time, it caused permanent loss of output and income, and in many cases, employment. But we're now dealing with what I would call the post-crisis malaise, a whole lot of interconnected problems which are causing quite a lot of anxiety. And those of you who are following the comments of the IMF, the US Federal Reserve, will be familiar with this list of anxieties. Now, whether this amounts to a potential for a major relapse or is just a kind of a qualification of a recovery story, only time will tell. But there are some really significant worries now out there. And I'll go through each of these in turn, but let me just summarise. First of all, we've got this massive overhang of debt, private and public sector, which hasn't gone away since the crisis, probably is actually increasing as a share of economies, and that in turn leads on to the theories of people like Richard Koo, who you may well have come across in relation to Japan, and going back to traditional economics, debt deflation, Irving Fisher, people of that kind writing a century ago, but an economic environment in which we have a problem of overhanging debt affecting the ability or willingness of people to spend and invest. Second, at a global level, and I stress at a global level, this isn't a specifically British issue, you have this classic Keynesian problem of ex-ante savings being greater than ex-ante investment. Weak demand, and I'll come on to talk later about what this means in terms of historically very low long-term interest rates, but we appear to have a systemic problem of weak demand certainly in Western countries, and an inability to absorb surplus savings. Thirdly, what I call radical uncertainty. This is a term of art you will see increasingly employed. There's a very good book just come out from Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England. It's basically theoretical economics. It's not a kind of anecdotes about my life as governor. There's very little kiss and tell in it, but it's an attempt to redefine modern economics. And one of the central planks of his argument is that what we now suffer from is extreme uncertainty, such that businesses find it very difficult to make rational risk assessment, because in the background there is such enormous uncertainty. For example, about whether China is recovering or potentially faced with catastrophic weakness, whether the United States is stuck in a low-growth trap or not, the uncertainty caused by politicians in many contexts. In the UK Brexit debate, the UK's plunged business into the worst crisis of uncertainty for decades because of the referendum issue. And linked to those things above, a world of zero and possibly, in some cases, negative interest rates. A rather abnormal Alice in Wonderland type of world. The QE and the impact of QE on asset markets, the bubble phenomenon, which we can see in the British housing market particularly. Then what I call fragile finance. We've got banks that are more stable than they were in 2008, but they still have significant elements, in my view, of weakness and instability. And then, coming on top of all that, emerging market risk, the uncertainties about what's happening in China, the very, very extreme gyrations in the oil market, which of course affect the viability of a whole set of countries, Russia, Nigeria, Saudi, Iran, radically affected by big, big swings in the price of oil. So those are some of the elements making up what we sometimes call a post-crisis malaise. Now let me start with the first of these, which is aggregate indebtedness. Now, there are all kinds of questions, methodological questions, about how you sensibly look at debt. But the standard measure, which I've cited here, the international organisations like the OECD and IMF will use this, is to aggregate the debt of households, of the corporate sector and governments into an overall debt measure. And the denominator is GNP. And as you say in the case of the UK, we had, which is the thick dotted line, the UK has higher levels of aggregate debt in relation to GDP than the rest of the developed world. But the trend has been one of continuing increase up to and beyond the crisis. The crisis did not end this phenomenon. Now, some people would say, so what? Does it matter if, as a society, we have higher levels of debt? In the UK, of that 280%, about 80% is government, the national debt, public debt. About 50% is corporate. And the rest, 150%, is households, which is overwhelmingly mortgage debt. And it's been the rise in mortgage debt coupled with housing inflation that lies behind much of this rise in aggregate debt in developed countries, and particularly in the UK. Now, as I say, some people will say, why on earth are you putting that up there? It doesn't tell you anything. If you're thinking about private household debt, they will say, okay, you know, lots of people are borrowing money to buy houses and they're getting into debt. But on the asset side of the household balance sheet, house prices are going up, so what? You know, assets are offsetting liabilities. That's if you believe that this boom in property will go on forever. But I just introduced that slight qualification. But I start with this because it was very clear that it was the increase in aggregate indebtedness and the way in which the banking system used that indebtedness to create complex debt products that was at the heart of the financial crisis, the process of leveraging. And it's still with us. What I haven't shown there is the emerging markets. This is very much a developed country story. The big story in emerging markets is that China now has a position which is very like the UK, almost 300% of GDP. There's been a massive escalation of debt within the Chinese economy because the big expansion that's taking place in infrastructure and manufacturing and construction is financed on the back of debt, a lot of it frankly rather dodgy. But that's the story. So the question is, does that matter? Some of it, private debt, the optimist will say you don't need to worry about it because it's secured against property. The traditional view is that what really matters is government debt. This is, you know, all the arguments around austerity hinge around this point. Now, the point I would make here, and I argue this at some length, if you look at the labour, what I call the labour crisis period, actually government net debt was at historically rather low levels, and it hardly increased during the period of Labour government. And one of the things I did in the book, which has surprised some people, is as I've defended the record of Gordon Brown, actually, when he was running the economy. But he did make mistakes, did take his eye off the banks, ignored the build-up of household debt in the housing market. But in terms of the management of public debt, as you can see from there, the level of public debt before the crisis was not abnormal. When the crisis struck, of course, debt rose very sharply, public debt. And the reasons were that government revenue fell from the banking system, public expenditure rose, the need to finance people who lost their jobs in the post-crisis recession. And of course, the taxpayer acquired many of the liabilities of the bankrupt banking system. So inevitably, government debt rose. This understates where we are at the moment. It's currently 70 to 80%. And much of the argument around austerity hinges on this issue. The orthodox view, which I think had a certain amount of force back in 2010, is that if public debt rises rapidly to very high levels, you then have a problem because you're dependent on what Mr. Carney's called the kindness of strangers to lend money to the government. And if they lose confidence, then of course interest rates rise, the premium, the cost of borrowing rises, and you could get into a vicious circle of national bankruptcy in effect. And that was the situation I think we faced in 2010. And I don't think anybody believes that that's a problem today. And if you look at it in a wider historical context, this takes you back to the middle of the 19th century. And it prompts the question, well, what's all the fuss about? Why do we worry so much about public sector debt? Even if we believe now that the debt ratio is about 80%, which what the grey line is pointing to, compared with what it was in the middle of the 19th century, when Britain was conquering the world, and pretty good health economically, not particularly high. We accumulated enormous debt relative to GDP after the Napoleonic Wars, and the banking crisis also in the early part of the 19th century. And then, as you see, in the interwar period, an enormous amount of debt as a result of the First World War, the Great Recession, the Great Depression of the 29-31 period. It just went through the roof, and then wartime again, massive debt, soft loans from America written off, but we had enormous public debt, which dwarfs anything we have today. So that leads some people to question whether the government's preoccupation with public debt is justified. And I'm of the view, which is set out in the book, that under current conditions, we should actually be worried a lot less about this. When the cost of capital is close to zero, which it is in the market, you should be borrowing to invest in infrastructure and productive assets. But there is a big debate about it. George Osborne, you may remember, was very heavily influenced by the writings of Rogoff, who argued that once the debt ratio gets above 90%, I think was his figure, then you in danger of a sudden collapse of confidence in financial markets. Rogoff has since recanted to some extent his work. But we are not far short of that at the moment, about 80%. So there are very, very different views within the economic establishment as to how seriously we should take public debt. Now, one of the consequences of the post-crisis response is this world of, sorry, my figures on the left are a bit odd. I don't know how 0.13 and 1.38 got there. I took my eyes off the ball when I was doing it. But the central point I want to make is that we're dealing with historically very, very low interest rates. Once you factor in inflation, which is very low anyway, or negative in Japan, the real rates of interest long-term interest rates are actually negative, and official short-term interest rates don't actually show up in Europe and Japan because they're zero. So you're dealing with very, very low interest rates. Now this is partly policy. It's central banks using very low interest rates to stimulate demand, to get people investing and spending, to stave off recession, deliberate act of policy. You could argue that what saved the world from catastrophic depression in 2008 was the American Federal Reserve Governor, Bernanke, He'd actually done his PhD thesis on the 29 crash and had studied in particular the works of Milton Friedman, who argued that what caused that crash to become a profound depression were a lack of attention to money supply and the cost of money. And Bernanke, together with the British government, the Japanese and the European Central Bank, opted therefore for very cheap interest rates as a way of keeping money cheap and abundant. So that's one reason. The second reason is a factor I mentioned earlier, that we probably have a world oversupply of savings, enormous amount of savings being generated in China, Japan and Germany, being pitched out into globally integrated capital markets. There isn't the demand for the savings. Because of uncertainty, businesses are not investing, and governments are not investing because they're frightened of the debt problem. And so market interest rates are very, very low indeed. And you get an absurd situation, for example, if you wanted to lend money to the Italian government at the moment, I'm not sure you'd want to, but if you decided that that's something you wanted to do, you'd have to pay them to take your money. We're talking 10-year bonds. The yields are so low. And there's a brilliant piece of economic research, which I strongly recommend to any students, done by a man called Andrew Haldane, who is chief economist at the Bank of England. I think it's on the website, who did a long-term historical study of interest rates and concluded that we've currently got the lowest interest rate since the Babylonians. This is a very bizarre world, a very unusual world. So the sense that we have recovered and established some new kind of stable equilibrium is completely false. We've got a recovery, or sort of recovery, but it's sustained by this very abnormal monetary policy. The other element in monetary policy is of course QE. That what has been happening is that central banks, all of them, are out there buying up long-term securities from banks, insurance companies, in order to pump liquidity into the financial system in the hope that they will then lend as a way of stimulating the economy. Britain has stopped QE, at least for the time being, and as the United States similarly, but the European Central Bank and the Japanese Central Bank are vigorously using QE at this very moment in order to prevent their economies subsiding into a decline, falling output and falling prices, a deflationary cycle. And that's the technique that they're using to do it. There is little doubt, the economic research tends to suggest that QE has had a beneficial effect in the short run in staving off deflation and keeping economies going, but it's had all kind of very perverse side effects, one of which, of course, is pumping up asset markets, because what the banks have done, in particular the banks, have used the liquidity that they've got through QE to invest in property, and that has bid up the price of housing, and we see some of the consequences of that. This is a very important element of policy if we're looking at the UK. I mean, I would argue that probably the most disastrously misconceived area of policy in the UK is in relation to housing. And this, I think, sort of roughly catches the flavour of what's happening, except it's a bit out of date. And if we looked at the line at the end, it finishes in 2013. If I took it to 2015, it would now be up to something like 8. And just think about the implications of it. Historically speaking, the relationship between average house prices, and of course that takes a bit of getting your head around what is an average house price, in relation to income, has been about 3.5 to 4, something like that order, which meant that an average mortgage borrower could go along to a bank and building society and raise sufficient credit to buy a house at roughly median price. What happened in the great boom up to the financial crisis was that the ratio doubled, went up to about 7. And the implication, we got to a point where average families had no way could they possibly take out credit. So they were getting seriously overextended. We had this phenomenon of Northern Rock lending 125% of value. And in the United States, the subprime market, again, was feeding this property bubble. Now, since the crisis, you would have thought that this might return to normal. And in the United States, and probably in Ireland, it has. It hasn't in the UK. We're in a very, very dangerous position in the UK that prices are now rising again from a very high level. I don't know what the position is in Manchester, but certainly in London and the southeast of England, you now have a house price to income ratio in double digits, which means that unless you have an income of getting on for 100,000 a year, there's no way you can afford property in most parts of London. Even modest suburban Edwardian property is just unobtainable. And the consequence of that is that home ownership has collapsed completely. Very few people under 35 now remotely contemplate house purchase. I guess if you go to Burnley, it's a bit different. My friend, the local MP, took me up there a year ago. There are houses being sold, new houses for 95,000, which is, if you're in London, is incomprehensible. But across the UK, this is a very real and worrying phenomenon. Out of control housing inflation. And this says a little bit more about the same thing. Basically, what's happening in the housing market, it's partly a monetary phenomenon, The influence of QE, credit being pumped up, a policy that I vehemently disagreed with by my former colleague, Mr. Osborne, was Help to Buy, just simply inflating demand. But on the supply side, you see that since the peak in 1970, the number of houses is less than half, although there are a lot more people and there are a lot more households. So there's a fundamental supply and demand problem, quite apart from the problem of demand being fed in a rather dangerous way. Whoops, sorry. I think I've lost one, and I'm not allowed to go back apparently. So let me just describe it. Well done. Yeah. So continuing issues in the banking sector. Now, big question is, well, what's happened to the banks? They collapsed back in 2008, and it was an extraordinary phenomenon. Absolutely extraordinary. In the UK, we had 4 of the biggest banks in the world. Barclays, HSBC, RBS, Lloyds, all had balance sheets bigger than the British economy. They were gigantic financial institutions. Of course, much of their balance sheet was investment banking, and you can argue about how you double count the derivatives and so on. But nonetheless, they were massive, massive institutions. And apart from HSBC, they collapsed. Barclays survived as a private institution after it was bailed out by the Emir of Qatar, I think. But RBS and Lloyds went down, and you had to nationalise them. We had to nationalise them, you own them. Now, this is looking at it now. Where are we? Well, the UK still has enormous banks as a share of assets. We're up there with Switzerland and Ireland, quite unlike Japan and the United States. Question is, does it matter that we have these big banks that collapse? Does it matter? Well, first of all, they are a lot safer. One of the big changes after 2008 was that the regulators, the Bank of England now, insisted on much higher levels of capital and liquidity, some attention to leverage ratios, but that's not quite so radical. So they were made safer. We did put through one very big reform. I had my disagreements with Mr. Osborne, quite profound ones, but one thing we did agree on was the need to split the so-called casinos, the investment banks, from the retail banks. And we did this through what's called ring fencing. The legislation is now in effect, and Britain has actually led the world in terms of that aspect of bank reform. So the banks are safer, but nonetheless we still have this very, very large banking sector in the UK, and if anything goes wrong, we're still faced with the problems we've had before. Added to which, there are all kind of other issues about having a very large banking sector, the extent to which it creates a kind of enclave economy. I've often likened the City of London to the oil industry in countries like Nigeria. You have this highly sophisticated global industry behind a barbed wire fence, and on the other side of it you have a developing economy. And Britain's a bit like that. If you go to most small, medium-sized companies, there's no way they can raise capital, although we have these sophisticated banks sitting there serving the interests of global companies. So there are issues, continuing issues, about the stability and role of the financial sector. Now, I'd like to wrap up in a few minutes to give you time to ask me questions, but I'd like to deal with two things before I finish. The first is to reflect a little bit on the global picture and how this impinges on us. Now, this is a slightly pretentious chart. This is the history of the world in one chart. But I've made use of a brilliant piece of economic history, which I hope you've all seen, by a man called Angus Maddison, who works at the OECD and has compiled statistics going back 20 centuries. Now, you may think, well, can we trust it? But there are some, embryonic statistical stuff on food production in many countries, on trade, and using them, what Maddison has done is to help us to see the size of different economies at different stages of modern history. And if you go back to 1820, when Britain was just beginning the Industrial Revolution, of course China dominates the world economy. They have a much bigger population, of course, and the standards of the time, relatively prosperous. India was the second biggest economy in the world, and then the industrializing economies of Western Europe. The US didn't exist at that time, pretty much. If you then scroll forward to 1913, the United States has already emerged as the world's biggest economy. China, under its turbulent 19th century upheavals, shrunk. India was under the empire, didn't progress really economically. 1950, post-war, of course, the US is the unique superpower. But then we come to today, or today. The United States and China having roughly equivalent size of economies. India, probably now the third biggest economy in the world. We don't think of it like that, but that's the way it is. And India actually growing now faster than China. Potentially, if that happens for the next 10 years, very striking change in the way the world is constituted. Now, this matters because these are no longer just isolated peasant economies. They're big, semi-industrializing, sophisticated economies that do a lot of trade. China's impact on the world economy has been absolutely massive, driving down the price of manufactures over the last 2 decades, contributing an enormous amount of surplus savings, which is actually what fed credit in many respects. And in the last 2 years has started slowing down from vertiginous growth rates in double digits, now probably growing at 6-7%. And if you slow down a giant economy on that scale by that extent, the effects on the world markets are very substantial. You see that in the price of copper, tin, many food products, and then of course in oil. the big question is, are the Chinese going to stabilise their slowdown? I'm moderately optimistic that they will. They've got competent economic managers, but there are some pessimists who believe that they will not be able to do so, that the economy is seriously unbalanced, that they have massive debt issues, a bit like Japan before Japan's financial crisis in 1990, I think it was, and that they could stall. And if they do stall, seriously stall, then you're dealing with one of the two biggest economies in the world grinding to a halt at a time when the United States is also fairly anemic. So that's one of the big things hanging over us. Let me just sort of finally say a little bit about what I would be doing. I mean, I was a minister for 5 years till a year ago. I had my agenda in government. I just probably, in conclusion, if I were still there, you know, what would I be doing now? I think implicit in several of the things I've said, I think first of all, we just desperately need to get a grip on the housing market, absolutely out of control, financially unstable, massively socially divisive. So it is a supply and demand issue, it's also a monetary policy issue, so that's number one. I would look at, with growing concern, at the growing inequality in the UK. It's not just in the UK, but it is getting palpably worse. And that's not just a matter of feeling bad about poor people, it's the fact that there's quite a lot of evidence now that countries with high levels of inequality perform worse in growth terms. Some very good work the International Monetary Fund on that, in that area. I think thirdly, what I would want to do is develop something we did start in the government, which was an industrial strategy. As you see, I just picked out one chart, I could have used dozens, that Britain relatively underperforming in R&D. And we do know that if we focus on the long term, what matters is human capital, i.e. training, education, and innovation, applying science. And until very recently, Britain was doing badly in both, which is why we tend to have relatively low levels of productivity compared with Germany, US, and even France. And the purpose of having an industrial strategy, which I developed to some extent in the last 5 years, was to try to think long-term, think collaboratively with industry, to get more innovation, R&D. And we had some real success stories with the car industry, with aerospace, pharmaceuticals, creative industries. But under this new government, interest in that kind of stuff has waned. And linked to the industrial strategy, thinking long term. You know, the great bugbear in the UK are capital markets and equity markets that are terribly short term in their thinking. Very, very few people thinking 5, 10, let alone 20 years ahead. And if you're trying to get R&D in new generation of aerospace engines or environmentally friendly technologies, you need a long-term perspective. And the British economy painfully doesn't have one. So on that sort of somber note, I'll throw it to questions and discussion, but thank you for being very attentive to me.
Thank you for that, Vince. So now we're going to have questions from the audience. So we'll take a question at a time. If you could wait till Alana comes to you with the microphone before you ask a question, so we can get it recorded for our podcast. So we're at the back.
Hi, I'd like to say thank you very much for that talk. It's really interesting, and thank you Post Crash for organising such an event. My question is kind of about financial institutions and a fear of an impending financial crisis later down the line. Do you think that it's favourable to have harmonisation in the financial industry either on an EU level or on an international level? And if so, how do you think we can come about achieving something like that?
Well, you do have to have a fair degree of cooperation, which may amount to harmonisation, because if you don't, what tends to happen is you get what's called in the trade regulatory arbitrage. Basically, banks look for the weakest regulatory environment and simply move their capital there. So you have to have a coordinated approach. This has been done post-crisis under the aegis of something called the Bank of International Settlements, which sets standards which all major countries are expected to observe on capital for banks, for example. And the European Union has gone one step further because as part of creating a monetary union, they judge that they also need to have a banking union. So there are much tighter degrees of coordination within the Eurozone area. So I think that answers your question. You do have to have a commonality of approach. But there are many gaps. I mean, the British reforms, which I described, about splitting the investment banks and the retail institutions, had not been copied elsewhere. The European Union talked about doing it, but hasn't. The Americans followed a different route. And one of the consequences of that is that you then to get banks migrating from one place to the other to take advantage of weaker regulation. And we're effectively losing at the moment the investment banks because they think we've been too tough. So the answer to your question is yes, you do need a coordinated approach.
Another question?
Hi Vince, thank you very much for coming to talk to us and the organisers as well. I'm really pleased you spoke about housing policy, because I think housing is obviously one of the biggest contributors to all these problems. I was wondering what your opinion was on the policy solutions to housing issues. How do you convince people to build houses? Because obviously it's such an expensive thing for a government to do. The government could easily say, right, we're going to be a national house building society. Obviously that would be a massive expenditure, so I was just wondering what your solutions would be.
Well, I've got a chapter in the book about it, and it is a complex issue. There's no silver bullet, no single solution. But I think one is you don't artificially feed demand, hence things like I would scrap Help to Buy, disastrous idea. You do need, of course, increased supply of all kinds. One of the things that worries me at the moment is the disappearance of the social housing sector. Housing associations being forced to sell off their stock. Because one of the easy ways to get housing supply going is for local councils to do it. That's what was used to happen. I started my political life as a Glasgow City Councillor 40 years ago, and we built lots of council houses. They weren't all very good, but many of them are still there, and they're okay, and it helped deal with the supply issue. Thirdly, we have a worrying problem where the housing market is increasingly concentrated on a relatively small number of developers who have an interest, not necessarily in building more housing. I mean, if you've got an inflationary market in land and in property, and you're a developer somewhere in the interface between the housing and the land, you're constantly calculating the margins, right? And it may not actually make sense to build a house. You know, you may have got planning permission, but it may make more sense to sit on it and to wait for the house prices to go up a bit further, then you can get a bigger markup on your development. So there's all that kind of games being played at the moment. We've lost the diversity of builders and developers that we used to have before. And to some extent we can deal with that through tax policy. And I think the fourth and final thing I would say is that you do need an industrial policy for the construction industry. The British construction industry is very primitive compared with, say, Germany or Sweden. The use of advanced technology is not well developed. What is much worse is that there is very little training. There were large numbers of, I mean, not just talking about bricklayers and plumbers, but, site managers. A lot of those people disappeared in 2008, 2009. They become taxi drivers or whatever. They no longer work on building sites, and we've lost their skills. And the industry doesn't have a capacity for systematic training in the way the Germans have through their apprenticeship scheme. One of the things I tried to do in government was to get much more emphasis on apprenticeship development, respect for vocational skills and so on, but that's a big cultural thing that takes a generation. So, dealing with the housing problem involves tackling things on all those different levels.
Have a question? If you're going to back right. Kind of ready.
Hi, yeah. You also said, further to the housing bubble thing, you also said about inequality is one of the things you wanted to tackle. I was just wondering how you would tackle inequality in terms of in Britain.
How would I tackle
Inequality, as you said, is one of the issues.
Well, again, I think there are several dimensions to this. I mean, obviously tax policy is relevant. I'm not actually in favour of very high levels of tax on marginal income. I think 40% probably is a sensible top rate of income tax. But what we are badly missing is a system for taxing wealth and property assets particularly. We came very close to an agreement on this actually in the coalition. There's a little story I tell in the introduction that I struck a bargain with Mr. Osborne that we would agree to have the top rate of income tax at 40%, and in return he agreed to bring in a mansion tax on very, very high value property. But unfortunately it was overruled by Mr. Cameron, who was concerned about all his friends in their big mansions and party owners, and we never got there. So what I would want to assure is that we have a proper taxation of assets, wealth, which we don't have at the moment. One of the most wicked things the government's done actually is lifting the inheritance tax threshold to a point where virtually nobody pays it. And that is another way in which you can tax assets, and we're not doing it. So taxation is one area, concentrate on property, land. Secondly, we're getting extraordinary executive compensation, which bears no relation whatever to the performance of companies. I've no personal problem with people getting very large payments, providing they're genuinely innovating or adding to national wealth. But what's happening is that you're getting companies which are actually losing money, paying their top executives tens of millions of pounds. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation. And executive pay is being set totally irrationally. All companies are trying to get into the top quartile, which by definition is not possible. They don't have this problem to anything like the same extent in Germany or France. This is a very Anglo-Saxon problem. I did try in government to bring in some reforms where there are now binding shareholder votes on pay policy, and that has acted as a restraint, but I think we probably need to go further. And having an obligation to consult the wider workforce would be one way of dealing with that. I think a third area is, is in terms of social mobility. What's happening is not just that we have wide inequality, but we have increasing social immobility. It's becoming more and more difficult for people from poor backgrounds to progress in life. And a lot of that has to do with early education, neglect of lifetime learning opportunities. So I think that a lot more invested in education and the particular kinds of education that help people with disadvantaged backgrounds make progress. So those are three things.
I think there was one round near the centre.
Just a bit of a political question rather than an economics question. You've spent a lot of time with the Conservatives that now make up the Conservative government. Do you think that in the aftermath of this referendum that it will destroy the Conservative government, especially considering what you were talking about earlier of businesses entering into radical uncertainty? And surely a stable government is probably one of those things that...
I don't know what effects it will have on the Conservative Party. They have an extraordinary capacity for hanging together and concentrating on being in power, much more than other parties. So it may not do them enormous damage as a party, but I think it will have an effect on the country that is really quite serious. I mean, it's difficult. There's a big public debate and both sides exaggerate. But I think the overwhelming bulk of economic analysis from serious economic people who've got no axe to grind is that if we did leave the European Union, two things would happen. The first is that there would be a major economic shock because, uncertainty, this thing I call radical uncertainty. What happens, for 2 years, 3 years, we have no idea what our relationship with the rest of the European Union would be. We don't know whether companies that currently trade in the single market will continue to be allowed to. We don't know what the relationship will be with other trading partners. So you're creating a massive shock through uncertainty that will have major impact on investment. That's the first consequence. And the second, standard trade analysis, some of you will have done this in your economics courses, does show that if you end a customs union, single market, whatever you want to call it, there are large economic losses which are permanent. It may be eventually in 10, 20 years' time you get new patterns of trade, but there would be massive disruption and losses associated with it. And there are arguments as to whether we're talking about 5% of GDP or 10% of GDP, but significant economic losses as a consequence. What is very striking about the politics of all this is that it isn't just a left-right issue. The key determinant of how people will vote is their age. And I do a lot of speaking on this subject. And if I go to audiences with young people, they're overwhelmingly Remain. And if I go to talk to old people, people of my generation, they're overwhelmingly for Leaving. And when you try to get behind the mindset, it's that they don't like modern Britain. It's multiracial, it's open, it's not the way it was in the 50s, and they want to go back. And the reason why that's important is that older people vote, younger people tend not to vote. And you may find that demographics determines the outcome, which would be worrying because it's young people who have to live with the consequences.
Any other question? Over there in the middle.
Thanks, Vince. My question is, do you think this week's announcement from Barclays that they're prepared to offer 100% mortgages suggests our banks have learned very little from the housing crisis? Sorry, the banking crisis?
Completely mad and very dangerous. The Bank of England should be stopping it, actually. It's the fact that there's no what they're doing is they're helping a handful of people to get over the line, but at the expense of pumping up the market even further. And this is exactly what happened in 2007. You may remember Northern Rock, who were the first bank to go down, the Newcastle Bank. And it was based on that kind of absurd lending, and they depended, of course, on what was called funding on international markets to support the loans that they were making. And when the markets dried up, they weren't able to continue. And I mean, history never repeats itself, but this is a very dangerous, foolish thing to do.
Another question?
Just behind you.
Down here.
Hi, my question is about ring fencing. Recently, Goldman Sachs in the US, they opened up their banks to the masses for $1 each. Do you think that ring fencing in the UK has been effective in that case to prevent Goldman Sachs from opening up the banks for the middle class and the low class?
Sorry, I caught about half of it.
Sorry.
It's about...
My question is about ring fencing in the UK, the legislation which has prevented Goldman Sachs from opening up the banks to the masses, because in the US they open up the banks for $1. So do you think that is being effective? My ultimate question is, do you see ring fencing being effective?
Right. No, I think ring fencing it's actually proving very costly for the banks, and they hate it. But I think we're reasonably well assured that it's working. And when we put this through Parliament stiffened the legislation. It's now called electrified ring fencing. If a bank tries to misbehave and smuggle, say, derivatives into their retail operation, so it's different government, then they can be forced to divest the whole of their investment banking operation. So there are some potentially radical sanctions built into it. The Americans did different reforms, which were quite radical, but they haven't gone back to what's called the Glass-Steagall legislation, which existed in the interwar period. The Clinton administration got rid of it, and there was at least part of the problems in American banking relate to that liberalisation. One of the candidates, I think it's Sanders, is clamouring to go back there, but it doesn't look as if it's going to happen in the US.
Another question, I think there was one down there in front.
Hi, thank you for your time. And my question was, I understand you're an optimist regarding China's future, but what systemic risks do you believe it's facing, considering how its industrialization is reaching a point where it's put to a halt and they're building ghost towns like in Tianjin?
Again, I'm not quite sure I fully heard the question. I mean, the Chinese have passed through a key transition in the last few years. Those of you who do development economics will be familiar with the Lewis turning point, where you no longer have surplus labour. And China has now got to that stage. The idea of being able to rely on large amounts of surplus labour very cheap in order to provide the basis for export industries and so on, that's gone. They're now having to adjust very quickly to being a relatively rich and relatively old society, and that means switching resources very quickly, historically, out of heavy industry, which accounts for some of the problems we're now having in the steel industry, because they've got vast excess capacity, and switching resources into service activities, both private and public sector. And trying to do this quickly, I mean, it's like trying to turn an oil tanker very quickly in a harbour, and it's causing all kind of potential frictions. But they are doing it. There were some figures out last week which suggested that GDP in some of the traditional industrial provinces of China, like the northeast, is now falling quite heavily. And the reason China's still growing is because the modern, high-tech, service-based sectors are doing so much better. So my impression, and I know more about India than I do about China, but I went more or less every year when I was Secretary of State to meet leading Chinese officials. And I was actually quite impressed by their economic sophistication and their ability to understand that they had a real problem and to engage with it. I mean, there is a bigger issue in China, is how do you produce a modern, sophisticated economy when you don't have a liberalised political system. Now that's not imminent, that's a problem they've got to resolve over the next 10, 20 years.
Right, I think there's a question down there. Front.
Hello, sir, Vince Cable. My name is Daniel, and I'm currently a student in New York. And I would like to ask, there's currently a development in New York called York Central, and it's one of the biggest developments in the north of England, and one of the biggest brownfield sites
Which is that?
in England. York Central.
Europe Central?
York.
York Central. Oh yes, I know that.
Yeah.
I come from
If you have this situation, theoretically, what would you think is the best way to develop it? Through affordable housing, as well as what constitutes affordable housing, since the meaning has changed over recent years? A mix of business and residential? A mix of high residential luxury buildings and affordable housing? Or purely a business, like the idea of a railway academy in the middle of the city, keeping in mind the current transport problems York faces?
Well, for those of you who are not familiar with the great city of York, there's, if you ever travel through it, York has this wonderful 19th century station, and round it there's about a square mile of derelict land, effectively, from the abandonment of the old railway industries. And the question is, what do you do with it? If you have and this is interesting, it's you in Manchester, you've got a lot of derelict sites, what do you do with them? I think the sensible answer, and I'm not a town planner, but I think the sensible answer is you need mixed development. Because if it's entirely consisting of housing, you basically get kind of housing ghettos developing and people having to commute long distances to work and so on. If it's all business, then of course the opposite problem arises, that you're separating the housing from the employment, and so people are having to commute backwards and forwards. And in a place like York, there isn't the transport to do it. It's an ancient medieval city, and you don't have a metro system like Manchester. So the sensible thing is to have a combination of the two, office space, creative industries, IT sector, combined with affordable housing. That would be my combination. In fact, I went there 3 weeks ago to support the council who are trying to do that.
Right, another question?
I'd like to ask about the budget surplus target set by the Chancellor. So, what is your opinion on the budget surplus target, and will the economy grow faster if, say, they achieve the surplus in 2020?
No, I disagree with the Chancellor's approach to the budget, and it was one of our disagreements in government. And I think the disagreement has got wider, because what's happened is the government have redefined what a deficit is. Very important point. When we went into the coalition government, we agreed that we needed to remove what was called the structural deficit in the current budget. Those of you who are not economists may find this jargon difficult to grasp, but basically you split the budget into two, current and capital. And the aim of fiscal policy in the coalition when we started was to deal with the current deficit, or that element of it that was structural in character. But what's happened is that Osborne has redefined the deficit to include all government borrowing. So he's basically said that in, I think, 2 years' time or 3 years' time, the government will not borrow anything, even for capital projects. Now that is terrible economics in my view. Sensible government should borrow for capital investment, particularly when you have access to cheap capital. But so that the objective that has now been set in fiscal policy, in my view, is far too restrictive, and it is sacrificing long-term investment for short-term rewards, such as they are from pleasing the financial markets.
Right, lady up there.
Hi, I wanted to ask about household debt. I think you said mortgage was about 80% of it, and I was wondering what proportion of student debt is now, because presumably that's a growing proportion of it.
Yes.
How significant it was.
Well, I think it's over 85%, 85 something percent of mortgage. There is, I mean, the bit that gets into the headlines are the kind of the very high interest lending. I forgot what the payday loans, this kind of thing. And there is a lot of abuse at that end of the scale. But in terms of quantity, the vast amount of household debt is mortgage debt. Student debt is in a different category. And we're in danger of getting into the whole vexed issue of student tuition fees here. But some of the student debt is debt. In other words, it is a fixed contractual obligation. But most of the tuition fee debt, as it's called, is not debt at all. And basically, if you're one of the sort of post-Brown, post-2010 students, if you graduate and you have an income under 21,000, you don't pay anything. It's an income contingent loan. How much you pay depends on your income. And if you don't have an income, you don't pay. So that's in a very different category from mortgage debt. Now, I know that students feel strongly about their debt obligations, and I can understand that. But it is a different kind of debt, and it doesn't have that kind of contractual rigidity that mortgage debt does, or debt from a moneylender. But it is growing, you're quite right, in terms of aggregates, it is growing.
I think we've got time for one more question. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Thank you, Vince, for a very excellent lecture, most impressive. And also for everything you did in your time in the coalition as well. Clearly with certain people sitting next to you, it must have been difficult on occasions. In Manchester and in London and many other cities, the buy-to-let and build-to-buy-to-let situation, often funded by foreign money, is taking many private homes, or the potential for many private homes, away from people completely, because they're being literally built and bought to let out. How would you address that bubble, that buy-to-let and build-to-buy-to-let bubble? How could we make it less attractive? So
well, I think you're basically right that within the overall housing problem, one of the sub-problems is that growing numbers of people see housing as an investment rather than as a place to live in. And one aspect of investment behaviour is buying property for letting. Many of the people who are doing it, of course, are not rich people. They're not institutional landlords. They're often former council tenants who have realised that they've been given an enormous asset by the government under the Right to Buy scheme, and they move out and then use their former council house for letting, and that's a lot of the right to buy, a lot of the buy-to-let is of that kind. Now, the buy-to-let market is now regarded, even by the Bank of England, which is fairly reticent to intervene, as dangerously overheated. And they are advising they're putting quite strong limits on banks' ability to lend for buy-to-let purposes. And George Osborne also has brought in some tax changes that will penalise buy-to-let lending. So I think the point you make is now understood by government and by the regulators. There is an additional element, I don't know whether this is true in Manchester, but in London, where some of the buy-to-let industry is international, to people who bought property from overseas as an asset and then let it out, or just, in some cases, just leave it empty. I think what is really wicked is leaving it empty. I mean, buying it and then renting it, well, at least you're keeping the market supplied, But what is unforgivable, I think, is people acquiring an asset in an area where housing is scarce and then just leaving it unoccupied. And you've got to deal with that through fairly penal taxes, I think, council tax. And again, to give George Osborne some credit, I think he's acted through stamp duty to penalise that kind of unproductive investment.
Great, so I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But now we're going to, in the next room over, we're going to have a book sale. So if any of that interested you, we've got the After the Storm book, and the paperback is just getting released tomorrow, but we've managed to get hold of it exclusively. It normally retails for £9.99, but we've got it at £7.99. So, and we've also got the hard book for £15.99, if you're interested in that. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. So I know you're busy with the exams, etc., but I'd like to thank you for making this event possible. And I'd like to have a massive round of applause for Vince. And like I said, we're going to the SU later. Thanks for joining us. We'll have a